Okay, so part two. What I have here on this messy page is just an SVG element here. This is just SVG. We have a button, okay, we have an H1, and we have a paragraph called stuff. So what I've done is just I've absolutely positioned things with top and left. And the reason why I'm using top and left is because I'm trying to make this really work badly. Normally when you're moving things around the page, you'd be using transformations. And you would never really use things like opacity, top, left. You wouldn't have box shadows on things you're moving around the page, this kind of thing. But we'll save that for another tutorial. At this point, I'm trying to make it really bad. That's the objective, okay? Let's have a look at what we have on our page. We have an SVG document here with a couple of little rectangles on it. I'm not really doing anything with that. I was saving that for another tutorial, but again, I've left it on the screen. What we do have is we have a paragraph and a button. Okay, let's have a look at our main.js. So I have a bit of event handling going here, so when I click this button here, that it's going to run a function called reset, which will just clear everything out and reposition everything. This clear interval, the stuff and things integer, are here, and they are set when we call draw things. So when I actually click on this little paragraph here, what should happen is it should fire draw things. This will create a couple of intervals. We talked about this in the other session. They're trying to run at 60 frames a second. Okay, and we'll get back to that in a second. So this will actually call a function called moveStuff and moveHeader. So I have two distinct animations running independently of each other, and all this stuff that you see here is just in a very, very bad way, moving things around the screen, purposefully, in a bad way. Okay? So here, that's the code. Let's show you what happens when we run it. So I'm opening up DevTools and I'm looking at the timeline here because I'm going to try and show you how these things work. If I hover over this SVG element, what you're seeing is a keyframe animation, which are highly optimized. And first of all, let me just show you how this works. So I'm recording and then I'm hovering over this thing. I'm going to let that do its thing, and then when I'm done, I press stop. And let's see what's happened. The thing you want to pay most attention to is the 60 frames a second. We are trying to get 60 frames a second. And that's what these animations do. When using keyframe animations, they're very, very optimized. Look at this, there's hardly any variance. And what do I mean by variance is the difference between these frames here. I can't even see it very well. But you can see how these are different heights. Okay, eyes are very sensitive to that stuff. And rather than have a lot of variance, say you had one like this, and then one like this, and then one like this, you're better off just having them all at 30 frames a second. Your eyes will be very sensitive to this stuff. That's called variance, okay? Let's get rid of that. Let me show you what happens when we click stuff. So I'm going to do the same recording again, record, and click on the paragraph. Now two things are happening. They're both trying to move at 60 frames a second independently as two separate animations. And I click stop, and let's see what happened. Okay, not bad. And again, if we're looking over here at this 60 frames a second stuff, kind of right down here, it's not bad. But sometimes it's falling short. Maybe it's 58 frames a second, maybe it's 40 frames a second, and there's a little bit of variance. So this is the stuff that the eyes notice. Okay, you want to avoid that. And how do we get around this problem? And the simple solution is to kind of group everything together in a page load, because these are individually running or trying to run at 60 frames a second. And the problem is your page might be refreshing at 60 Hertz or 60 oscillations per second, and it's trying to match that, and there's issues. Because when you're trying to paint, if you don't paint in time for the screen refresh, all sorts of problems occur. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of VSync and all these really complex low-level stuff. We'll save that for another time. Just know that you want to essentially time your animations with the page refreshing. And this became annoying for people that were working with things like Canvas that were doing full screen games. They were having to time all the individual animations with the page being timed, and that was the issue. And so what they thought about doing, and this was the best way to approach your animations, is to group these things together into one individual interval. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to refactor this code a little bit. Instead of calling draw things and having individual intervals, I would like to do something a little more like this. I would call moveStuff, and I would call moveHeader, and I want these to run together on a page loop. So draw things is actually loop the page or page render, something like that. And then what I would like to do is I would like to run page render every 60 frames a second. And so if I have a function called draw things, let's just do that. This will kick things off, and I want to call page render. So I could do set timeout, and I'm not going to use interval here because I want to get inside the function. And also, what I'm about to show you, the requestAnimationFrame, looks more like a timeout than it does an interval, and it's kind of frustrating. In a way, this requestAnimationFrame, which I'm going to show you in a bit, I wish they would have used an interval, but they use a timeout. And so what function would I like to run? I would like to call page render. Oops. And page render, how often would I like to run this? Well, why don't I set this to 30 frames a second. In order to do that, I would do this. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to separate that and put this up here. I'm going to say frames per second on the page. Set that to maybe 30 frames a second. And my interval, which is what I'm going to use for my timeout, will be something on these lines. I think I talked about this in the other tutorial. Okay, so now we have, whoops. Now we can use this as the page interval. So I want my page refreshing at 30 frames a second. So when I click the button, it's going to set a timeout to page render. I want to be able to clear it, so I'm just going to do a reference integer here, and I'm going to get rid of both of these. And I'm going to clear that out. And it's a timeout. So I refactored there. So my timeout gets cleared, everything gets reset to normal. The reference integer is called when I call draw stuff, and this is going to call a page render. And page render is going to fire. When it gets to the end of page render, I want it to call page render again. So the way to do this is write it like so. We did this near the session, yeah? And then I can just simply call page render here. I just showed it in those steps to be clear. Yeah? So click the button, we call page render, we try and run these two animations, and then we call page render again on a particular interval, and we can cancel it out. So this time let's try and run it at 30 frames a second and see what happens. Let's just clear all this stuff out. Bear with me. Alright. So it's smooth, but it's slow because it's 30 frames a second. Let's stop that, and let's also do this as well. Throw things up a bit, and stop. Let's see what that did for us. Okay. So this was running, the page was running at 30 frames per second and not much variance. That's actually quite good. When we started doing this thing, these were running at 60 frames a second, and in between those frames it was using these movements, and therefore it's jumping back up here to match this. Yeah? Okay, so that's what's going on there. Whenever you're doing a keyframe animation, you're getting a much better experience because that's done at 60 frames a second. But how can we get both of these running at 60 frames a second? Does that work? Well, let's try it. Instead of 30, let's set this to 60, which will work. With this calculation, it's probably about 58 point something. Okay, so let's clear all this out. Let's try one more time. So recording. Clicking on this. That doesn't seem 60 frames a second, but we'll soon find out. And stop it. Yeah, these are 30 frames a second. I've got a horrible feeling I didn't save it. And I didn't. And I did that last time. Gotta stop doing that. Sorry, guys. Okay. Clearing all this out, and let's make a start. Click. That's smooth. And I've got this. I'm interjecting with that. And stop. And stop. Okay, so what you see here, the keyframes are working quite nicely. That's when I was doing that stuff, yeah? But the rest of it is 60 frames a second, but sometimes it's going up to 30. And that's because there are many considerations on the browser. I mean, we're trying to say, okay, every 60 frames a second we're going to repaint the screen, but bear in mind, remember I showed you this on the other tutorial, that this is when it's getting added to the queue. It's not necessarily when it's going to paint. What we could do with knowing is when the page is about to paint and make sure that all our animations fit in that 16 milliseconds. So say for example that move stuff and move head, I know they don't, but say this was 6 milliseconds. That took 6 milliseconds. This one took another 6 milliseconds. You might think, well, that's 12 milliseconds. There's plenty of time. But if the composition and everything that browser's doing adds another 6 seconds onto that, you're going to miss page refreshes, and that's why you're kind of seeing this stuff. Right? So what we need to do is we really need to find out a little more about the browser and all the stuff that's going on. I mean, if I'm doing other stuff on the page, like hovering over things, clicking on things, I've got event handlers that need to be dealt with visually on the page, and it's just adding all of this extra stuff, and it doesn't have room to fit your frames in the 16 milliseconds, and you end up with all this janky stuff. Now, if you had access to that level of detail inside your page render, you could potentially set this value here to be something a lot more useful. You could say, well, when does this start? Let's look at some high performance definition times, find out when it's starting, when it's ending, do some clever calculations based on browser and knowing how browsers clamp and all this clever stuff, and change this. That's what you could do, and you could really get very efficient stuff. But I've got some great news for you. You don't have to worry about it, because they have a built-in function designed for finding out when the page is going to be animated and the frame's going to be painted, and that's called requestAnimationFrame. So I'm going to refactor this, and you're going to see the difference. requestAnimationFrame. Now with requestAnimationFrame, the computer knows better than us, so I ain't even going to tell it when to do it. It's going to figure it out. I would have loved it if you could have done clearAnimationFrame, yeah, like this. Would have made a lot of sense, right? But they want to use the word cancel, just something you've got to live with, and that would be using requestAnimationFrame. Let's see if they're any better at figuring out when the page should be loaded and rendered. See if they're doing a better job than we can do. So let's try and run this. Let's clear this out. Here we go. Silky smooth. Let's use my stuff over here and stop. Wow. To me, I'm zoom right in here, this is much better. I mean, you do have a little bit, okay? But it's not like it was before, with these things. This is much better. In other words, the browser, with its requestAnimationFrame, has a lot more information. Knowledge is power. It knows this stuff, so it can provide a better experience for you. And in fact, your script-like animations, because there's two types of animations. There's a native one that happens when you do all this stuff with, say, CSS, and that works very, very well. But when you're script-based animations, if you don't use requestAnimationFrame and loop everything together in one page refresh, you're going to have all sorts of problems. Everything's going to look janky. You're going to have page tearing and VSync issues. So this is the best way of approaching your animations. Group them all together. Use requestAnimationFrame because the computer knows better than you do for doing this stuff. You could get really fancy because they do actually give you a timestamp in here, which is a very, very high definition timestamp. And you could figure out the calculation of all your individual animations and make sure that you do have enough time before they do another page refresh. This is telling you when they're going to do another page refresh and draw again, and you could do some really clever calculations at a low level if you wanted to. But as you're probably not game programmers, I don't think you need to worry too much about that. What you'd probably be interested in is making sure your animations are smooth. So the takeaway is this: use requestAnimationFrame, but even better, in my opinion, you should be using CSS in a lot of these things. If you can get a decent 60 frames a second with things like left and top and opacity, which are big no-nos for animating things, then when you remove your box shadows and your text shadows and you start using transformations, you'll have really slick animations across the board. Alright, anyway, I hope that's been relatively interesting. I'm not going to go any deeper than that. I think that's deep enough for my current target audience for this channel. Okay, see ya. I said I was going to show you a requestAnimationFrame inside a timeout. I forgot to do that, so I'm going to do that now. I'm also going to show you something about polyfills. So there's two things I want to quickly talk about. I'm going to append to this little video that I forgot to cover. So if we have this inside a set timeout, And then we can run a function like this. And I can declare a frames per second. I could say I want this to run at 30 frames a second, right? I can put all this inside of it. Now people are advocating this. I do not advocate this. I think this is a bad idea. Let me just try and run this and see what happens. Okay. Just clear this. And start that up, record, and start. Oh, that would help if I added an E in there, wouldn't it? Set timeout. Okay, so let's clear this and let's make a start. So what you're doing is you're forcing 30 frames a second here, and you think you're getting the efficiency, but if I was to stop now, it doesn't even stop because I haven't wired up the stopper, but that will keep going, but I still can show you this. You see, now you're saying 30 frames a second, okay? But at some points it's going down to very high frame rates here. And I don't recommend doing this because if you start to increase it, say you set this to 60 frames a second, let's try and run that. So this will go at 60. To me, that doesn't look quite smooth. Now, I know we're on a screen recording, so you can't obviously see the same level of detail as I can because the video itself that you're looking at is about 30 odd frames a second. It's not 60, so it looks worse than it is. On my screen, it looks fine, but the previous one that I had looked even better. And look at this, and things are not good at all. So this concept of choosing your frame rate is a really bad idea. Okay, so hopefully that's clear now because you can see it. It's not just me saying it, I'm showing you, right? So you don't want to do this. This is a very, very bad idea, and for people that are advocating that, slap wrist. Let the requestAnimationFrame do its thing. One other thing I wanted to show you, if we want to run requestAnimationFrame and say an old browser doesn't have an ability to have requestAnimationFrame, you should always do obviously progressive enhancement anyway, but if you're trying to polyfill this, you can. There is a polyfill from Paul Irish. Let me just see if I can bring that in. I'm not a huge fan of this personally, but I'll put it in anyway. So what I'm doing is I'm overriding requestAnimationFrame here with his polyfill. A couple of issues I have with this. This is, I guess he's done it so it works on old Internet Explorer, but there's better ways, faster ways to get date. You can also use high performance timestamps in there, high definition timestamps. Yeah, not a huge fan of that, but let's run it, okay? So record, clear all this out, and let's make this work. So here we go. And off it goes. It looks smooth, but I'm going to start doing some animations and stuff, and then I'm going to click stop, which obviously will allow me to see this. Now that's not bad, is it? It's not bad, but if I was to zoom in here and look at this, it's okay, right? But let's just, in fact, let me take a snapshot of this real fast, okay? So this is not bad, right? And let's go back and get rid of it, so you're actually using the real one. So this is the real Slim Shady. Oops, clear all that out. Here we go. The real one. Moving the stuff around. And stop, and stop. Okay, and I'm going to bring the other image up that I had here. Let me zoom in. Very similar, right? But if you have a lot of things going on the screen, that polyfill isn't going to be taking those things into account. If I've got event handlers going on and all these different things happening on my page, it's not going to be as efficient. But a polyfill is better than nothing, okay? It's definitely better than nothing. Alright, so there are the two things I wanted to cover that I forgot to cover in the class. Alright, speak to you later.